Welcome back to another video in motorcycle engineering and design. In the previous video I shared a combination of using surface forming with parametric surface modeling to model a rear tailpiece, finishing it off with some decals. In this video I'll be continuing with experimenting with surface forming and parametric modeling to model a rough set of fairings. If you're interested in seeing more advanced developed fairings, then do give the video a like, let me know in the comments down below, and I welcome getting that to you as soon as I can. So it's always useful to have a reference image, not that we're going to be copying the design, but we're just going to use it for reference for scale and size, and it can also be a useful reference for the mounting points. So this sketch is the concept for my sports fairing. Of course it's comprised of a nose piece, upper and lower fairing, and then I have an extra piece over the top which I'm just going to call the engine shield. In this design I'll be revised a little bit just to get the crash bungs to fit through the fairings. Now I am never completely happy with things, so this design is likely to change. Now if you're new to surface forming and you are planning to use it for a project, I do recommend just spending some time playing around with a throwaway model. So moving on to the actual modeling here, I start with the right hand fairing piece. To keep a nice surface I use the fit to point spline, and then I extrude that surface the full length of the bike. Using the transform tool we can then move that around into position, and then also to add some more interesting angles and some lines we can then rotate it. And whilst it doesn't look like much now, when we start to merge this with other surfaces, the lines and the angles will start to come together. Once you got into a position and the rotation we like, maybe we need to adjust the lower and the top edges, so we can just drag those again with the transform tool. Now, as the bodywork gets tighter and tighter into the frame and the engine, we end up getting much closer to various components that we need to then make clearances for. One very common example would be the engine casing. So here we add a surround for the engine casing, and we start the sketch with a center point arc. Then we can extrude a surface from that, making sure it goes through the other surfaces that we've generated. And also we can add a taper to add a little bit of extra shape to this profile. Then I come in again using the move feature to move it into a more ideal location. Creating a new offset plane, we repeat the same process to create another surround around this mounting point here. So in this case we make the taper a lot larger, and we start playing around with the surface forming tools to make the geometry a little bit more interesting so that it merges in a bit nicer with the fairings. So in order to merge each of these features nicely into the fairings, we'll need to keep track of the number of points or segments that we have around each of these profiles. So now I want to start working on the main fairing, which is going to merge into that rounded surface that we created earlier. And I'm going to start from the bottom, extruding out. So I like to use the crease tool to prevent certain surfaces from being warped by other modifications we make surrounding it. In this case I'm dragging the outer edges up, and I don't want to ruin this flat surface on the bottom. We can also try rotating some of these lines and see if we can create some more interesting geometry. At this point I want a few more surfaces, and I want them to be a bit higher up, so I can drag this surface up using Alt to create some extra surfaces. Then we can use the move tool to morph these surfaces, the points and the edges, into the kind of profile that we want. And like I did for the engine casing, I used the center point arc here around the wheel to carve out this front edge of this fairing. And for now we'll just extrude that as a surface, and we'll use it later on when we trim these surfaces down to a more final version. And here we can also tweak it to fit our side profile. Now I do want a flat surface as well, so I'm just going to extrude a flat line vertically. And now here is my collection of surfaces that I'll be using to form my first draft. Just need one more surface, which is going to be the side profile of the fairings. Now with everything ready, we start trimming down our surfaces. Sometimes we'll have to extend our surfaces so that we can complete our trims nicely. And in other cases, if we start trying to merge some of this geometry in the state that they're in, we're going to have some strange geometry once we try to round them. So we'll typically overextend them, merge them together, add the rounds, and then trim the profile away after. So here we come to where we merge the lower surface and the flat surface. So currently I think this looks very dull and boring, but we can come in and select the top edge here and then rotate that edge to create more interesting lines. I also want to add a little bit more shape to this upper edge here, so I extend it out and then I use a curved sketch profile to trim it back again. Once that's been trimmed, I then create a plane at the end of the curve, and then I sketch a curved profile to sweep along this edge. Now we can come back to our profile and start trimming these surfaces back again. So I want to extend the bottom geometry here, so I deselect the tangent chains so I can just select the surfaces that I want or the edges that I want, and then I extend those out. I then use a sketch profile to trace out the shape that I want, and then I'll extrude that through as a surface to trim it away. So just to build the surfaces just behind the front wheel, I start with making an offset of our external surface. This one's going to trim away the front surface, as you can see here, which will extend through the surface so we can trim it away nicely. There'll be a few extra bits of tidying up around this area, including some rounds just to tidy up the look. So I want to add some additional features, and just to show, we can do this just by creating a shape externally and then moving it into a position that we're happy with. In this case, I've extruded a cylinder with a draft, and then I've moved that into position, rotated it, and now I'm going to trim the inside of this cylinder away using the surface of the fairing. Now in order to merge this the shape into the fairing, I actually need to cut away the same profile. So using a sketch on an offset plane, I project the profile of this feature, and that gives us a sketch profile that we can then extrude and cut away from the fairing. Now I want to cut away a little bit more geometry, and just to show, if we create geometry like this, we have enough material to then add rounds, but in this example I haven't actually done that. Here I create a plane on 3 points so that I can add a new sketch profile, a new curve, which I'm then going to extrude in the opposite direction with a draft or a taper, and then I'm going to use that to trim and merge into the fairing as well. So we start with using the fit point spline to create some nice surfaces. In the fit point spline we can drag the points after placing them, but we can also select those points and then manipulate the handles to affect the curvature. Then create a series of additional curves which are going to be used for reference when using the forming tool. These curves are currently made in a 2D plane and I can then drag them into position, but ideally you would use the 3D sketch for this. And you could also use those 3D sketches, those splines, to bridge between each other to create the geometry. So here I'm just using the move feature to move these lines to be roughly in line with what I've used as reference when tracing them. So I start with extruding a surface from this line on the center plane. And if you want, we could do that with all of the splines that we've created here. So from now I'll be trying to bring some shape to this nose piece, and I'll start with just rotating some of these lines, adding in new lines, and seeing how I can make it fit amongst the profile that we've created with the other curves. So I feel like this is where I really started to learn how best to use surface forming. It's also where I started to enjoy the process more. So I found that with surface forming, it takes some time to get used to it, but it's really beneficial to play around with it, because making the mistakes and then learning how to fix them, I think that's what makes you better with surface forming. And I'd say I've definitely learned from my mistakes, and I've learned some better methods of using surface forming so that I can create the shapes that I actually want to make. As you can see here, using the crease feature to strengthen this curve so that we can delete these surfaces where the windshield would be. But just to improve the quality of this edge, we use the smooth feature on these surfaces to get a nice smooth line. Using these handles to morph the profile at the edge. And then here using the transform tool to create new surfaces and pull them around until we match the shape that we're looking for. So it's around this point that I'm happiest with this nose piece. But there's quite a few features missing, and one of the important ones would be the windshield. So here I just start to add the geometry with a projected sketch from a plane that's positioned above the bike. I project that on the vertical axis so that the sketch fits nicely onto the surface that we created here. We use this surface to drive a sweep, which will be the mounting surface for the windshield. And then just to trim this back in line with the profile here, we then extrude that previous curve back through this surface and trim it away. And since I merged the lower surface in, we've ended up with a much sharper, much harsher lower surface, which I don't really like. I would definitely change this in a later design. Now at this point I see that it's kind of missing some geometry. I need to bring something in that's going to connect the nose to the main fairing. So here I extrude the surface with 3 sections so that we have some ability to manipulate the surface later on. And I use the insert point to create a curve, trying to match the form of the nose piece. Then I drag a new surface down so that I can then delete this top edge. Now with this surface I then use the transform tool to move it roughly into shape, and then you start adding some new curves to match the profile from the side, with some final adjustments just to make it line up a little bit better. Deleting that top edge, now we have it fitting fairly nicely to the fairings. Then I change back into box mode so that I can see the points, and I start adjusting this to try and make it a nicer profile and modify it into something a bit more interesting. So for that I needed to create some extra surfaces, some extra points, using the subdivision and then inserting points like this. I can then select these surfaces and drag them in with the transform tool to make this slightly more interesting geometry. But I'm not going to leave it open like this, so I need to morph and warp this lower edge until it's more enclosed. I also see this flat piece on the bottom of the fairing, and I created that using the crease and flatten features, and this will be for the connection to the middle piece of fairing. So I am still playing with forming, so this part is going to be very experimental, very crazy shape. This is not something that I would plan to use, but it's just to practice making the shapes and making the features. So here again I start with a straight surface yet again, and then I just start pulling these points around using the transform tool, and then add in some subdivisions so that I have a bit more freedom to morph the surface. And then I use the crease to create some more solid lines or some sharper lines, and just using that with the transform tool I ended up with something like this. Now the inner edge of all these surfaces is very inconsistent, so you can see how you'd want to use one surface to create these parts, even if it's across multiple parts, or even make all of this as one piece and then split it later on. So here just playing with the colors, and I realized that I've got this strange curve from the top to the middle piece, which I hadn't noticed whilst I was modeling. And no fairing is complete without a large hole in the middle. In this case it's going to give clearance for the crash bungs, but it's also just a good exercise for the future designs. So using an offset of the projections of the profile of this surface in a sketch, then extrude a surface to trim out this hole in the fairing. Then we can make that a bit more interesting by adding a taper to it. And then also to trim that back so it's not too deep, we can use an offset of the external surface and then filling the hole with a patch feature. So from here there's just some minor adjustments to line up the edges of these fairings just so that they fit a bit more nicely. Now I then mirror these parts across the bike as components, and then we have a full set of fairings. Noticing that on the left side, because the engine is asymmetrical, we have a casing bulging through, so the left side will actually have to be modelled separately, or at least modified. Now this has been a fun exercise, but there's so many components missing from this bike that these fairings do not take into consideration these parts in the design or the packaging or even the function. So definitely come back and revisit this when I have some more components in the cockpit area especially. So you'll see now that I do also have some other concepts. So this is my second concept where I tried to focus on making a nice smoother surface and then adding in some different features like this, the lower fairing here. If you are interested in seeing something a little bit more developed rather than these more rough concepts, then do let me know in the comment section down below, and I'll work on getting out some high quality designs as soon as possible. Now I have pretty big plans for this project, and I'm going to make a video covering all of it. I'm really looking forward to sharing that, and most importantly getting feedback. I'd love to know what people think about my ideas in general and the project as a whole. Now if you have stuck around to the end, I just want to say thank you very much. If you have any requests, please leave them in the comments down below, and I'll see you next time.